Take a deep breath, get comfortable, and let me tell you a story.
The entire bank went silent. Not the kind of silence that happens when customers finish their transactions. This was different. The kind of silence that makes people slowly look up from their phones. The kind that makes a mother stop counting her cash. The kind that makes a little boy lower the lollipop in his hand and stare. A pen slipped from someone's fingers and hit the floor. Nobody picked it up. The branch manager burst out of his office so quickly that the door slammed against the wall behind him. A phone was clutched tightly in his hand. His face had lost all its color. "What did you just say?" he asked. Nobody answered, because everyone was looking at the computer screen in front of Joan. A few seconds earlier, she had been standing proudly behind her desk, convinced she had protected the bank from a fraud attempt. Now her knees felt weak. One of the tellers swallowed hard. "Did he?" the woman whispered. She looked around as if she wasn't sure she should even say the words. Then she finally did. "Did he just request a $90 million withdrawal?" The question seemed to hang in the air. $90 million. Even saying the number sounded unreal. Joan blinked. Once, twice. "No," she said softly. "That's not possible." But nobody was listening to her anymore. The branch manager stepped closer to the screen. He read the account information once, then again. His breathing became uneven. "Oh my God." Joan's fingers tightened around the edge of her desk. She suddenly felt cold. Outside, rain tapped gently against the bank windows. She turned her head. Through the glass doors, she saw him, the man she had just humiliated, the man she had refused to help. He was walking calmly toward an old pickup truck, parked near the curb. Nothing about him looked wealthy. His jeans were faded. His boots were covered in mud. His jacket looked old enough to belong to another decade. He opened the truck door and climbed inside. The engine started. A young employee standing near the entrance suddenly went pale. "I know him," he said. Nobody answered. He looked directly at Joan. "That's Richard." She frowned. "What, Richard?" The young man looked as though he couldn't believe she was asking. "The Richard." The manager slowly lifted his eyes from the computer. He looked out the window, too. Then he whispered words that made Joan's stomach drop. "The man who practically owns this bank." For a second, nobody moved. Nobody breathed. Joan's mouth opened, but no sound came out. Outside, Richard's old pickup slowly pulled away from the curb and disappeared into the rain. And the worst part? He had never raised his voice. He had never argued. He had simply folded his check, thanked her for her time, and left. At that moment, Joan felt something she hadn't felt since moving to Montana. Fear. Real fear. Because she suddenly realized one terrible thing. She hadn't just embarrassed a customer. She may have destroyed her own future, but that wasn't even the worst part. The worst part was that 3 days later, she would be carrying a cardboard box out of that same bank while people watched from the sidewalk. And it all started because of $5. 3 days later, Joan sat alone at her desk. The bank was open. Customers were coming and going. Phones were ringing. Printers hummed in the background. Yet somehow, everything felt quiet. Too quiet. A small cardboard box sat in front of her. Inside it were a few family photographs, a coffee mug from Chicago, a notebook filled with career goals, and a framed picture of her parents standing proudly beside her on the day she graduated from college. She stared at the picture, her mother's smile, her father's tired but happy eyes. They had sacrificed so much to get her where she was. Long shifts, missed birthdays, extra jobs, years of telling their daughter that education would open doors. And now, Joan slowly looked down at the employee badge lying beside the box. A few minutes earlier, it had been clipped to her jacket. Now, it had been taken away. The empty spot on her chest somehow hurt more than she expected. She swallowed hard. Her eyes burned. She blinked several times. The tears stayed anyway. A woman from customer service walked past her desk and lowered her voice. "I'm so sorry, Joan." Joan tried to smile. It didn't work. Across the lobby, 2 tellers avoided looking in her direction. One of them quietly packed away paperwork from her station, as if she had already disappeared. The branch manager stepped out of his office. He looked older than he had 3 days earlier. Tired. Uncomfortable. He opened his mouth to speak, but nothing came out. What could he say? Sorry? Good luck? Some mistakes are too big for easy words. Outside the large front windows, several people had gathered on the sidewalk. Small towns have a way of learning everyone's business. A delivery driver paused beside his truck. An elderly couple stood near the flower planter. Even the owner of the diner across the street had stepped outside. They were all looking at the bank. At her. Joan felt her cheeks grow warm. She quickly lowered her eyes. A lifetime of hard work. Years of ambition. A new beginning in Montana. And now she was leaving with a cardboard box. The branch manager slowly approached her desk. He looked down at the box. Then, at her, his voice came out quietly. I never thought it would end like this. Joan didn't answer, because neither had she. A long silence passed. Finally, she whispered, I was trying to do my job. I know. I thought I was protecting the bank. I know. Tears rolled down her cheeks. The manager looked away for a moment. Then he said the sentence that would stay with her for the rest of her life. You fired the wrong man. Joan closed her eyes. Not because she had officially lost her job. Not because the people outside were watching. But because she finally understood something that had taken her years to learn. She never really saw Richard. She saw muddy boots, an old truck, wrinkled clothes, a wet $5 bill. And she built an entire story about him in her mind. A story that wasn't true. She opened her eyes again. The cardboard box suddenly felt heavier. Outside, someone pointed toward the bank. Another person whispered something. Joan couldn't hear the words. She didn't want to, because the truth was already painful enough. She had spent her entire life worrying about being judged because of where she came from. Yet she had done the exact same thing to someone else. She looked at the family photograph inside the box again. Her mother's voice seemed to echo in her memory. Treat people kindly, baby. You never know what battles they're carrying. Joan's lips trembled. If only she had remembered those words 3 days earlier. Because 3 days earlier, this entire disaster began with a man walking into the bank, carrying a soaked $5 bill. And that man had no idea his simple visit would change both of their lives forever. 3 days earlier. Before I tell you how one wet $5 bill turned an ordinary afternoon into the biggest mistake of Joan's life, I need to ask you something. Have you ever been judged because of your clothes? Because of your old car? Because people looked at where you came from and decided who you must be? If you have, take a second and press the like button and leave a comment saying, never judge a book by its cover. It may seem like a small thing, but your likes and comments help YouTube share stories like this with more people. And trust me, today's story carries a lesson that every one of us needs to hear. Welcome back to Mr. George Stories, where life's most powerful lessons come wrapped in unforgettable tales. If you're new to this family, thank you for joining us. Please hit the subscribe button, because it helps us share stories like this on YouTube. Now, let me take you to a small mountain town in Montana, a place where people wave at each other from their trucks, a place where the waitress at the diner already knows what most customers are going to order, a place where news travels faster than the weather, the kind of town where everyone believes they know everyone else, or at least they think they do. On the edge of that town sat an old community bank. Nothing fancy. Just a brick building with white columns, flower pots near the entrance, and employees who had spent years serving local families. Generations had trusted that bank with their savings. Farmers, ranchers, teachers, retired couples. Almost everyone in town had walked through its doors at one point or another. Most days were quiet, predictable, but not this day, because before the sun went down, one misunderstanding would leave an entire bank in shock. A young woman would question every assumption she had ever made, and a man who had spent years avoiding attention would suddenly become the center of it. This isn't just a story about money. It isn't even a story about a bank. It's a story about grief, about pride, about second chances, and about the dangerous habit of deciding someone's value before hearing their story. Sometimes the richest person in the room isn't wearing an expensive suit. Sometimes the strongest person is carrying a pain nobody can see. And sometimes the smallest moments create the biggest consequences, all because of $5. So settle in, because this story begins on a rainy afternoon in Montana. A father had just finished repairing a broken fence on his ranch. A young banker was trying to prove she belonged in a town that still didn't feel like home. Neither of them knew they were only a few minutes away from changing each other's lives forever. And by the end of this story, you may never look at another stranger the same way again. The rain hadn't started yet. Over the mountains outside town, thick gray clouds were slowly gathering, but the morning was still bright. The little Montana town was already awake. A rancher parked his truck outside the diner. The owner of the hardware store swept dust from the sidewalk. Someone waved from a tractor on the edge of town. A dog barked somewhere near the gas station. Nothing ever seemed to happen too quickly there. People liked it that way. The mountains surrounded the town like old friends. Pine trees stretched across the hills, and long fences cut through fields where cattle grazed peacefully. Many people left this town when they were young. Some came back. Most didn't. Richard had. Several miles outside town sat an old ranch surrounded by open land. The house wasn't huge. It was comfortable. A wooden porch wrapped around the front. Flower pots sat beside the steps. A wind chime gently moved in the morning breeze. Near the barn, a man was repairing a broken fence. His jeans were covered in dirt. A faded blue shirt clung to his back. His boots had seen better days. Sweat rolled down his forehead as he hammered another nail into place. At 38 years old, Richard looked more like a hard-working rancher than a man with enough money to buy half the town if he wanted to. He stepped back and studied the fence. Still crooked. He smiled. Good enough. A small voice called from the porch. "Dad!" Richard turned immediately. A little girl burst through the front door and ran across the yard. She almost slipped on the grass. He dropped the hammer and caught her just in time. She laughed. "You were running too fast." "I won," she said proudly. "You were racing yourself." "I still won." Richard chuckled. "That's impressive." The little girl wrapped her arms around his neck. "Dad, are we still making pancakes tonight?" He looked serious for a moment. "Pancakes?" She nodded. "The ones with extra syrup." He pretended to think. "I don't know. That's a pretty big request." She smiled. "Please?" He couldn't help smiling back. "Of course." She hugged him again. For a few seconds, he simply held her. Moments like these mattered. More than money, more than business, more than everything he once thought was important. The little girl pulled away. "You look messy." "I've been working." "You look like one of the cows." Richard laughed. "Thank you very much." She giggled and ran back toward the porch. He watched her go. The smile slowly remained on his face. Then his eyes moved to the house. A framed photograph sat inside the kitchen window. A woman smiled back at him. Even from a distance, he knew every detail of that picture. He had taken it years ago. She had been laughing at something he said. Her hair moved in the wind. Her smile looked effortless. He stood there for several seconds. Some losses never stop hurting. You simply learn how to carry them. There were mornings when he still reached across the bed expecting her to be there. There were evenings when he almost called out her name. And there were moments, especially when he looked at his daughter, when missing her felt brand new. He took a slow breath. "Dad?" He looked up. The little girl stood on the porch again. "You okay?" He smiled softly. "Yeah." She studied him for another second. Children notice more than adults think. Finally, she smiled back. "Can I feed the horses?" "After you finish your homework." She made a face. "I knew you were going to say that." "I know." She sighed dramatically and disappeared inside. Richard laughed quietly. A truck pulled into the driveway. An older rancher stepped out. "Fence giving you trouble again?" Richard nodded. Seems like it. The man climbed over the fence. You fix this thing every year. And every year, it breaks again. Maybe the fence is trying to retire. Richard smiled. The man looked around. You coming into town today? I might. The diner has peach pie. That changes everything. The older rancher laughed. People in town liked Richard, not because of his money. Most of them had no idea how wealthy he really was. They liked him because he helped neighbors repair barns. He showed up when someone lost livestock. He donated quietly whenever a family struggled. He listened more than he talked. In a small town, kindness travels a long way. The older rancher looked at him. You ever think about slowing down? Richard looked toward the pasture. Not really. You've earned it. Maybe. The man smiled. I still think you work too hard. Richard shrugged. Work helped. Keeping busy helped. Silence sometimes didn't. The older rancher understood that. Everybody in town knew Richard had lost his wife. Nobody spoke about it much. Some pain deserves privacy. The older rancher tipped his hat. See you in town. See you. The truck drove away. Richard looked at the broken fence one last time. Then toward the house. Then toward the sky. Dark clouds were moving in now. Rain was coming. He remembered the check inside his jacket. He had meant to deposit it earlier in the week. He kept forgetting. He wiped his hands on his jeans. Maybe today was the day. He walked toward the porch. Dad! The little girl called from inside. Yeah? Don't forget the syrup. He laughed. I won't. A few minutes later he grabbed his keys from the kitchen counter. His eyes briefly stopped on the photograph again. The smiling woman looked back at him. He touched the frame gently. Then he picked up his jacket. Outside, the first cool breeze of the afternoon crossed the ranch. Richard climbed into his old pickup truck. He started the engine before going home to make pancakes. He decided to stop by the bank. On the other side of town, someone else had been awake long before sunrise. Joan stood in front of the small mirror in her apartment and adjusted the collar of her blouse. She did it once, then again, then a third time. Finally, she stepped back and stared at herself. Everything looked fine, professional, neat, exactly the way she wanted. Yet she still felt nervous. She always felt that way before work. Her apartment was quiet, too quiet. Back in Chicago, mornings had never been this silent. There had always been something. A neighbor playing music, cars honking outside, children laughing on the sidewalk, her mother's voice coming from the kitchen, her father's television playing the morning news. Here in Montana, all she could hear was the soft hum of the refrigerator. She picked up her coffee mug and walked toward the window. Outside, the street looked almost empty. A pickup truck passed. A woman walked her dog. That was it. Some mornings, she still couldn't believe she lived here. She had moved nearly a year earlier, but the town still didn't feel like home. She missed Chicago. She missed crowded streets. She missed family cookouts. She missed hearing gospel music on Sunday mornings. She missed dropping by her parents' house without making plans weeks ahead of time. Most of all, she missed feeling like she belonged somewhere. Her phone buzzed. A message from her mother. Have a good day, baby. We're proud of you. Joan smiled. A second message appeared. Don't work too hard. She laughed softly. Too late. She had been working hard her entire life. Growing up, money had always been carefully measured in her home. Her mother worked long shifts as a nurse's assistant. Her father drove city buses across Chicago for years. Neither complained. They simply worked. Every single day. Joan remembered nights when her mother came home exhausted and still found enough energy to help with homework. She remembered her father falling asleep in his chair after working extra shifts. She remembered hearing them whisper about bills after they thought she had gone to bed. Those memories never left her. They became fuel. By the time she was in high school, she had already made a promise to herself. She would never struggle financially. She would build a career. She would succeed. She would make her parents proud. And she would never let anyone think she wasn't good enough. That last promise had followed her everywhere. In college, at her first banking job, even now. Especially now. Montana had not been easy. Some people had welcomed her warmly. Others looked at her with curiosity. A few treated her like she wouldn't stay long. She noticed everything. The long pauses, the surprised expressions, the questions. Why would you leave Chicago for Montana? Don't you miss the city? You really chose to move here? At first she laughed about it. Later she stopped laughing. The truth was simple. She had accepted the transfer because it was a chance to move up, a better title, better pay, a chance to prove herself. If she succeeded here, bigger opportunities would follow. Failure wasn't an option. She placed her coffee mug in the sink and grabbed her purse. A few minutes later, she parked outside the community bank. The building looked peaceful in the early morning light. She took a deep breath. Another day, another opportunity. Inside, the bank was already coming to life. Computers powered on. Employees greeted one another. Someone brought donuts. Someone else complained about the weather forecast. Normal things. Comfortable things. Joan sat at her desk and logged into her computer. The branch manager stepped out of his office. "Morning, everyone," a few people answered. He looked serious. "Before we open, I need everyone's attention." The room grew quiet. Joan looked up. "We've had reports from other branches about fraudulent checks and account scams. Some of them looked very convincing." Several employees exchanged glances. The manager continued. "Double-check everything. If something doesn't feel right, ask questions." Joan listened carefully. "We've also had people trying to pressure employees into rushing transactions. Don't allow it." He paused. "Protecting our customers and protecting this bank comes first." Everyone nodded. The meeting ended. People returned to work. But Joan kept thinking about those words. If something doesn't feel right, ask questions. She repeated them in her head, again and again. She had worked too hard to damage her career because of one careless mistake. A fraudulent check, an overlooked detail, a bad decision. No, that would never happen to her. Around lunchtime, she was still thinking about the warning. A customer approached her desk. She checked the account twice. Then, a third time, another customer came in. She asked extra questions. One of her coworkers smiled. "You know they're not all criminals, right?" Joan laughed politely. "Just being careful." "You've been extra careful all morning. Can't hurt." Her coworker shrugged. "I guess." But Joan couldn't let it go. The warning had settled into her mind and refused to leave. By the afternoon, she was noticing everything. Who looked nervous, who seemed impatient, who didn't fit. She hated that thought the moment it crossed her mind. Didn't fit. What did that even mean? Still, the warning stayed with her. Protect the bank. Avoid mistakes. Prove yourself. Outside the windows, the sky had turned dark. The first raindrops tapped softly against the glass. A customer looked outside. "Looks like we're getting a storm." Someone else nodded. The rain quickly became heavier. Joan glanced at the clock. A few more hours, and she could go home. She reached for her coffee. At that exact moment, headlights appeared through the rain. An old pickup truck slowly turned into the parking lot. It wasn't fancy. The paint looked worn. Mud covered the tires. The truck parked near the entrance. The driver's door opened. A tall man climbed out. His jeans were dirty. His boots looked dusty. Rain immediately began soaking his jacket. Joan watched him for only a few seconds before returning her attention to the paperwork on her desk. She had no idea that the man walking toward the bank doors was about to change the course of her life. Outside, Richard closed the truck door and started walking toward the entrance. Rainwater dripped from his sleeves. Inside his pocket sat a wet $5 bill, and folded carefully inside his jacket was a check worth millions. The bell above the bank door chimed softly. A few customers looked up. Rain followed Richard inside in tiny drops that slid from his jacket and landed on the floor. He paused near the entrance and removed his hat. Then he ran a hand through his damp hair. The drive from the ranch had been short, but the rain had come down harder than he expected. He looked around the bank. Nothing had changed. The same potted plants near the windows. The same brochures lined up neatly on a table. The same framed photographs of local ranches hanging on the walls. He had been inside this bank many times over the years. Most of the employees knew him. A few had even attended his wife's memorial service years ago. But today, several familiar faces were missing. The bank had hired new people recently. He didn't think much of it. He simply walked toward the customer line and waited his turn. A little girl standing beside her mother looked up at him. "Mom, that man is all wet." Her mother smiled apologetically. Richard laughed softly. "I think you're right." The little girl grinned. The mother looked embarrassed. "I'm sorry. No need to apologize. She's telling the truth." The little girl giggled. A few people in line smiled. Richard smiled too. He had always liked children, especially now. Being a father had changed him in ways he never expected. He reached into his pocket and felt the folded $5 bill. Still wet. He shook his head. His daughter had given it to him that morning. She had insisted he use it to buy extra syrup for the pancakes. Then the rain had soaked it while he fixed the fence. She would be disappointed if he came home with a ruined bill. Maybe the bank could exchange it. A simple request, nothing more. "Next, please." Richard stepped forward. The woman behind the desk looked young, professional, perfectly dressed. Her name tag read, Joan. She gave him a polite smile. "Good afternoon. How can I help you today?" "Afternoon." He removed the damp $5 bill from his pocket. "It got soaked in the rain. I was wondering if I could exchange it." Joan looked down at the wrinkled bill. Of course. She reached for it. Then she noticed his muddy sleeves, the dirt on his boots, the old jacket. Something about him seemed unusual, not dangerous, just unexpected. Richard reached into his jacket again. "And I also need to cash this." He unfolded a check and placed it gently on the counter. Joan glanced at it, then looked again. Her hand froze. The amount written on the check was enormous. For a second she thought she had read it incorrectly. She blinked. No. The number was real. Her eyes moved to the name. "Richard." She looked back up at him, then at the check again. A strange feeling settled in her stomach. The morning meeting came rushing back. Fraud. Fake checks. "Be careful." She lifted the check. "One moment." Richard nodded. "No problem." Joan examined the paper. She turned it over, looked at the signature, then looked at Richard. Something didn't make sense to her. A man dressed like this? Driving an old pickup? Carrying a check worth millions? She looked again. The amount almost seemed unreal. A few customers nearby had begun paying attention. One of the tellers glanced over. Joan lowered her voice. "Sir? Where did you get this?" Richard looked surprised. "It was issued to me." She frowned. "I understand that. But where did it come from?" He gave the name of the financial company. Joan typed something into her computer, then looked back at him. The uneasy feeling remained. She had spent all day thinking about fraud, about scams, about making mistakes, and now this. A huge check. A customer she had never seen before. Clothes covered in mud. An old truck outside. Every alarm in her head seemed to ring at once. Richard waited patiently. A few seconds passed. Then, another. Finally, Joan said carefully, "This is a very large amount." He smiled politely. "Yes, it is." "You expect me to believe this belongs to you?" The smile slowly faded from his face. "I'm sorry?" She tapped the check. "This doesn't seem right." Richard blinked. "I assure you it is." Joan crossed her arms. The teller beside her looked uncomfortable. "Sir, we've had several fraud warnings recently." "I understand. This check could be fake." The words hung in the air. Several customers turned their heads. Richard looked at her quietly. "I don't think it is." Joan gave a short laugh. The sound carried farther than she intended. "You'd be surprised what people can print these days." Someone near the waiting area looked up. Another customer stopped filling out paperwork. Joan shook her head. I've seen fake checks before. She looked directly at him. This honestly looks like something printed in somebody's garage. Silence. The entire bank seemed to stop. Richard didn't move. He simply stared at her. The smile had completely disappeared. Not anger. Not outrage. Something else. Embarrassment. Deep embarrassment. A man who had spent years avoiding attention suddenly found himself standing in the middle of it. A customer coughed awkwardly. The teller beside Joan looked horrified. "Joan," she whispered. But it was too late. Richard slowly looked around. Several people were watching him. One woman quickly looked away. An older man lowered his newspaper. Nobody spoke. Richard turned back toward Joan. His voice remained calm. "I see." He carefully took the check from the counter, folded it once, then again. He slipped it back into his jacket. The wet $5 bill remained on the counter between them. For a moment neither of them touched it. Joan still believed she was protecting the bank. She was certain she had done the right thing. Richard picked up the damp bill and slid it into his pocket. "I'm sorry for the inconvenience," he said quietly. The words surprised her. He was apologizing? He reached for his hat. Then he stopped. He looked at Joan one last time. There wasn't anger in his eyes. Only sadness. The kind that comes from being misunderstood. Finally he spoke. "Sometimes people are carrying more than they appear to be." The sentence was soft, almost gentle. Then he placed his hat back on his head, turned around, and walked toward the door. Nobody stopped him. Nobody said a word. The bell above the entrance chimed again. Rain waited outside. Richard stepped into it and disappeared toward his old pickup truck. Inside the bank, an uneasy silence settled over the room. Joan slowly exhaled. She believed she had protected the bank from a scam. She had no idea she had just humiliated one of the wealthiest men in Montana. Behind her, one of the newer employees suddenly looked toward the window. His face lost all color. He stared at the man climbing into the pickup truck. Then he whispered words that made the hairs on the back of Joan's neck stand up. "Wait." He looked from the window to the check information still open on the computer screen, then back toward the truck. His eyes widened. "I know that name." Joan frowned. "What?" The young employee swallowed hard. "Richard." He looked as though he couldn't believe what he was seeing. And for the first time that day, fear began creeping into the room. Fear began creeping into the room. The young employee was still staring through the window. Rain rolled down the glass as Richard's old pickup slowly disappeared from view. "You know him?" Joan asked. The employee looked at her as though he couldn't believe the question. "Everybody around here knows him. I've never seen him before. That's because he doesn't come into town much anymore." Joan frowned. The employee stepped closer to her desk. "Did you say his name was Richard?" She nodded. He looked at the computer screen. Then he looked at the check information. A strange expression crossed his face. "Oh, no." The branch manager walked over. "What is it?" The employee swallowed. "I think that's Richard from the old ranch outside town." The manager looked confused. "Which ranch?" "The one near the lake." The manager's face changed. He looked at the computer, then toward the door, then back at the screen. "No, that's what I thought too. No, that can't be." Joan looked from one person to the other. "What is going on?" Neither answered immediately. The manager grabbed the mouse and pulled the customer information onto the screen. His eyes moved across the account details. He suddenly became very still. The room seemed to lose all sound. "Sir?" one of the tellers asked. The manager didn't answer. "Sir?" He looked up slowly. "Get me the account records." "What? Now?" The urgency in his voice startled everyone. A teller hurried away. Joan's stomach tightened. "Can someone please tell me what's happening?" The manager looked directly at her. "That customer?" He stopped, almost as if he couldn't find the right words. "You know him?" she asked again. "I've met him twice." "And?" The manager let out a slow breath. And he's one of the wealthiest people in this state. Nobody moved. Joan actually laughed. A nervous laugh. That's impossible. No one joined her. She looked around. Every face looked serious. You're joking. The manager wasn't. But he came in wearing. She stopped herself. Wearing what? Old clothes? Mud on his boots? Suddenly those reasons didn't sound very convincing. The teller returned with additional records. The manager opened them. His face lost color. He sat down heavily in the nearest chair. One of the employees leaned closer. Oh my goodness. Another employee covered her mouth. Joan's pulse began to race. What is it? Still, no one answered. She stepped around her desk. The manager turned the screen toward himself, almost protectively. Sir, you're scaring me. He looked up. You should sit down. The words made her even more uneasy. I'm fine. No, Joan. Sit down. She didn't. The manager rubbed a hand across his face. I need to make a call. He hurried back to his office. The door closed, then locked. The employees stared at one another. What just happened? One whispered. Nobody knew. A minute later, voices could be heard from inside the office. The manager sounded distressed. Another minute passed, then another. The rain outside became heavier. Customers continued walking into the bank, completely unaware that something extraordinary had just happened. Joan remained frozen. She kept replaying the scene, the check, her words, the customers listening, Richard's face, most of all. His expression when she suggested the check had been printed in a garage. A knot formed in her stomach. No, there had to be some mistake. The manager opened his office door. Joan, she looked up. Come here. She followed him inside. He closed the door behind them. For a moment he simply stared at her. Then he asked quietly, Tell me exactly what happened. I already did. Tell me again. She explained everything. The wet $5 bill, the check, her suspicions, the joke, the customers. The manager listened without interrupting. When she finished, he closed his eyes. Please tell me what's going on. He looked at her. You may have just insulted one of our largest clients. She blinked. What? He has accounts all over this institution. No. Yes. She shook her head immediately. That's not possible. It is. But he doesn't look. She stopped again. The manager's eyes softened. He doesn't look rich? Her face turned warm. She didn't answer. You know, he said quietly, I've learned something working in this town. She looked at him. The people with the most money usually don't feel the need to prove it. Silence. The words settled heavily between them. She sat down. Suddenly, she didn't feel well. The manager's phone rang. He answered immediately. Yes? A pause. Yes, I know. Another pause. No. He just left. He listened for several seconds. Then his expression changed again. What do you mean? A longer silence followed. Finally, he whispered, Oh my God. He slowly lowered the phone. What? Joan asked. He didn't answer. What happened? The manager stood, walked to the door, locked it again. Then he turned back toward her. The executive office wants every account connected to Richard pulled up immediately. Why? He looked at her. His face had gone pale. Because they think he might move his money. Joan stared at him. All of it? The manager didn't answer. He didn't need to. A few moments later, the account records finally appeared on the screen. The manager looked first, then the tellers, then Joan. Nobody spoke. Nobody breathed. Because the numbers on the screen were so large. They almost didn't seem real. Everyone froze. Nobody spoke. The numbers on the screen seemed impossible. Joan blinked several times, then leaned closer, then leaned back again. There had to be an error. The manager refreshed the page. The numbers remained. He refreshed it again. Nothing changed. One of the tellers whispered, Are those accounts really his? The manager swallowed. Yes. All of them. Yes. Silence settled over the office. Joan looked at the screen again. She had spent years studying finance. She understood money. She understood investments. But this was a different world entirely. The manager's phone rang again. He answered immediately. "Yes, sir." Everyone watched him. "I understand." A pause. "You're serious?" Another pause. The manager slowly sat down. His face turned pale. "Yes, sir. I'll handle it." He ended the call. Nobody moved. Finally, Joan spoke. "What happened?" The manager looked at her. For a second, he seemed older than he had that morning. "He called another branch." "Who did?" "Richard." The room became quiet again. "He requested paperwork." "What kind of paperwork?" The manager took a slow breath. "Transfer paperwork." Nobody understood at first. Then one of the tellers gasped. "No." The manager nodded once. "He wants to move $90 million. A pen slipped from someone's hand. Another employee covered her mouth. Joan simply stared at him. $90 million? He nodded again. A strange ringing filled her ears. The room suddenly felt smaller. A few minutes ago she had thought she had protected the bank. Now she couldn't even process what she was hearing. "You're saying he's taking his money out? He hasn't signed the documents yet, but he wants to?" The manager didn't answer immediately. Then he said quietly, "Yes." The office fell silent again. Everyone knew what that meant. A community bank depended heavily on its largest depositors. Removing $90 million would not simply be a bad day. It could become a disaster. The manager stood up and paced. Then his phone rang again. Another call. Then another. Within minutes, the entire bank seemed to transform. The peaceful afternoon disappeared. Employees hurried from one desk to another. Computers clicked. Printers started. Voices grew tense. The manager disappeared into his office again. Joan remained in her chair. She felt cold. This couldn't be happening. It had all started less than an hour ago. One customer. One check. One terrible assumption. The office door opened. The manager stepped out again. He looked directly at Joan. "The executive office wants a complete report." She nodded weakly. "They also want a written statement." Her throat felt dry. "A statement?" "Everything that happened. Every word." She lowered her eyes. Every word. Suddenly she remembered exactly what she had said. "This honestly looks like something printed in somebody's garage." The sentence made her stomach twist. Outside the office, the first whispers had already begun. One teller approached another. "Did you hear?" "Hear what?" "The customer from earlier." "What about him?" "He's moving $90 million. The woman's eyes widened. "Why?" Nobody answered. Because everyone already knew. A customer near the counter glanced over. "What happened?" The tellers immediately changed the subject. But in a small town, secrets rarely stay hidden. An elderly man standing near the entrance looked toward the manager's office. Something was clearly wrong. He could feel it. A woman at the drive-through window noticed the tension too. People began whispering, then wondering, then asking questions. Within an hour, word had started spreading. At the diner across the street, someone mentioned the bank was having problems. At the hardware store, someone said one of the wealthy ranch owners was angry. At the gas station, someone claimed a customer had closed a huge account. Each version changed slightly. But one thing remained the same. Everyone was talking. Inside the bank, the phones would not stop ringing. The manager answered one call after another. Corporate offices, regional offices, financial advisors, executives. The pressure in the building kept growing. At one point, the manager removed his glasses and rubbed his face. He looked exhausted. "What happens if he moves the money?" One employee asked quietly. Nobody wanted to answer. Finally, the manager spoke. "It would hurt." "How much?" He hesitated. "More than I'd like to admit." The room became silent again. Another employee looked worried. Could people lose their jobs? The manager didn't answer. That silence was answer enough. Joan slowly lifted her head. Jobs, careers, people's lives. She suddenly realized this situation was bigger than her, much bigger. Her breathing became uneven. No. No, no, no. This couldn't be because of her, could it? She remembered Richard's face again. He had never argued, never raised his voice, never threatened anyone. He had simply left, which somehow made everything worse, because anger would have been easier to understand. Calmness was harder. A phone rang again. The manager answered. Yes? He listened. His shoulders sank. I understand. He hung up. What now? An employee asked. He looked around the room. The executive team is coming tomorrow. Several people exchanged nervous glances. Tomorrow? Yes. Another long silence followed. Then the manager looked directly at Joan. She already knew what he was going to say. You should probably prepare yourself. Her voice came out barely above a whisper. For what? He hesitated. Then he answered honestly. They're going to want to know exactly why one of our biggest clients walked out of this bank embarrassed. The words hit her like a punch. Embarrassed. She had embarrassed him. In front of customers. In front of employees. Because of his clothes. Because of his truck. Because she thought she knew who he was. The room suddenly felt too warm. She stood. Then sat down again. For the first time since moving to Montana, she was afraid. Not of losing a promotion. Not of disappointing her parents. Not of failing. She was afraid because she finally understood something terrible. One conversation, less than 10 minutes long, might cost her everything she had worked for. And as the rain continued falling outside the bank windows, Joan realized her mistake might have just destroyed her career. The rain continued long after the bank closed. Most of the employees had already gone home. A few remained behind, speaking in hushed voices before finally gathering their things and leaving. By 7 o'clock, only 2 office lights were still on. One belonged to the branch manager. The other belonged to Joan. She hadn't moved much in the last hour. A blank statement form sat on her desk. She had started writing it 3 times. Each attempt ended the same way. She would stop after a few sentences and stare into space. Every word looked worse on paper. I believed the check might be fraudulent. I questioned the customer. I made a joke regarding the authenticity of the check. No matter how professionally she wrote it, the truth remained ugly. She had humiliated a man she didn't know. Her phone buzzed. Her mother. She let it ring. A moment later, another message appeared. Long day? Call me when you get home. Joan swallowed hard. For the first time since moving to Montana, she didn't know what to tell her parents. She had called them every time something good happened. Her first promotion, her transfer, her first day at the Montana branch. Tonight felt different. Tonight, she didn't want to talk to anyone. A soft knock interrupted her thoughts. The manager stood in the doorway. You're still here. She nodded. So are you. He gave a tired smile. I don't think either of us is getting home early tonight. She looked at the blank report again. Do you think he'll really move the money? The manager didn't answer right away. I don't know. She lowered her eyes. I need to talk to him. The manager looked at her. Why? Because I owe him an apology. You do? She looked up hopefully. So you'll help me contact him? The manager hesitated. He may not want to hear from you. I still have to try. Silence. Finally he sighed. I have his number. Her eyes widened. You do? He has bank accounts here. Of course I do. She stood immediately. Can I call him? The manager looked uncertain. Then he slowly handed her a business card. One call. She took the card carefully. Her hands were shaking. The manager quietly stepped out and closed the office door. For several seconds she simply stared at the number. Then she picked up the phone. Dialed. Waited. Ring. 2, 3. She almost hoped he wouldn't answer. Then a calm voice came through the line. Hello? Her throat tightened. Richard? A brief pause. Yes. It's Joan. From the bank. Silence. Not an angry silence. Not a cold silence. Just quiet. She took a breath. I know it's late. I'm sorry for calling. It's all right. His voice remained calm. That somehow made this harder. I wanted to apologize. Another brief silence. You don't have to do that tonight. Yes, I do. She closed her eyes. I treated you unfairly. You were doing your job. No. The word escaped before she could stop it. No, I wasn't. She opened her eyes again. I judged you. The line stayed quiet. She continued. I looked at your clothes. I looked at your truck. I assumed things about you. Still, he didn't interrupt. I embarrassed you. When he finally spoke, his voice was gentle. I've been embarrassed before. The answer surprised her. She didn't know what to say. Richard spoke again. People usually see what they expect to see. She frowned slightly. What do you mean? I spent years working in technology. You did? He gave a small laugh. Long time ago. You owned a company? I did. She sat down slowly. The man she had treated like a scammer had once owned a technology company. Why did you leave? The question slipped out before she could stop it. There was a long pause, long enough that she thought he might not answer. Then he did. My wife got sick. The room seemed to grow quieter. I sold the company. His voice remained steady. I thought I could fix everything if I spent enough money. Joan didn't move. But some things can't be fixed. A lump formed in her throat. When she passed away, he continued softly, I didn't care about business anymore. The words were simple, yet the sadness inside them felt heavy. I came back home. To Montana? Yes. Why? Another short silence. Because she loved this place. Joan looked down at her desk. Outside, rain tapped softly against the windows. I bought the old ranch years before we got married. His voice carried a small smile. We used to come here every summer. She listened quietly. After she died, I wanted my daughter to grow up where her mother had been happiest. For several seconds, neither of them spoke. Finally, Joan whispered, I'm sorry. So am I. His answer was calm, not bitter, just honest. She wiped at one eye. I had no idea. How could you? She swallowed hard. I still shouldn't have treated you that way. No, he didn't say it harshly. Simply as the truth. She closed her eyes. The honesty hurt more than anger would have. I think, she began slowly, I think I forgot something important. What? That people carry things you can't see. Silence. Then she heard him breathe softly on the other end of the line. My wife used to say something similar. Joan smiled sadly. She sounds wise. She was. A few seconds passed. Then Richard laughed quietly. You know, she would probably tell me not to hold a grudge. The sound of his laughter surprised her. It wasn't loud. It wasn't forced. It was warm. For the first time that day, she realized something. This man wasn't angry. He was hurt. There was a difference. And somehow, that made her feel even worse. She looked around the empty bank, the desks, the chairs, the computer screens. Everything suddenly seemed unimportant. Because while she had spent the entire day worrying about protecting her career, the man she had judged had spent years learning how to live with loss. A loss far greater than money. A loss that couldn't be replaced. She remembered his face in the lobby, the sadness in his eyes. She understood it now, at least a little. Richard? Yes? I don't know what's going to happen tomorrow. Neither do I. But I want you to know something. She paused. I am truly sorry. A few moments passed. Then he answered quietly. I believe you. The tears she had been holding back finally escaped. She covered her mouth. I'm so ashamed. Don't be. I deserve to be. No. She looked up. You made a mistake. She laughed softly through her tears. A pretty big one. Maybe. Another pause. But mistakes are supposed to teach us something. She wiped her cheeks. And what did this one teach you? He didn't answer immediately. Finally he said, that I still don't look like a billionaire. Despite everything, she laughed. A real laugh this time. So did he. The sound lasted only a few seconds, but somehow it eased the heaviness in the room. Then silence returned. A softer silence. Joan looked at the dark window beside her desk. For the first time all day, she wasn't thinking about $90 million. She wasn't thinking about executives, or investigations, or even her job. She was thinking about a man who lost his wife, came home to raise his daughter, and still found enough grace to comfort the person who had humiliated him. A fresh wave of tears filled her eyes, because at that moment she understood something painful. She hadn't judged a wealthy man. She had judged a grieving husband, a devoted father, a person carrying a sorrow she couldn't begin to measure. And sitting alone in the quiet bank, Joan finally broke down and cried. The next morning arrived cold and gray. Joan barely slept. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw Richard standing at her desk. She heard herself making that joke about the check. She saw the look on his face again. Embarrassment. Disappointment. Then, she remembered the phone call. His kindness somehow made her feel worse. By 6:30, she was already dressed for work. She stood in her apartment holding a cup of coffee that had gone cold. Her phone buzzed again. Another message from her mother. Hope today is better than yesterday. Love you. Joan smiled sadly. She didn't reply. She didn't know what to say. A few minutes later, she parked outside the bank. Something felt different immediately. 3 unfamiliar cars were sitting near the entrance. Dark-colored sedans. Official-looking. The moment she stepped inside, she understood why. 2 men and a woman stood near the branch manager's office. Each carried a notebook. Each wore a serious expression. Corporate. The manager looked exhausted. When he saw Joan, he gave a small nod. They're here. Her stomach dropped. The woman looked at her. Joan? Yes. We'll need to speak with you later. Her mouth suddenly felt dry. Okay. The woman gave a polite smile, but it didn't reach her eyes. The investigators disappeared into the manager's office. The door closed. The bank opened 15 minutes later. Nobody acted normally. Employees spoke quietly. Every ring of the phone made someone look up. Even customers seemed to notice the tension. A man walked up to a teller. Everything all right around here? The teller smiled. Just a busy morning. The man looked toward the office. Looks more serious than busy. She forced another smile. The man eventually walked away. Inside the office, the questioning had already begun. One employee went in. 10 minutes later, she came out looking pale. Another employee was called. Then another. The atmosphere inside the bank became heavier with each passing hour. Finally, the office door opened. Joan? She stood immediately. Her legs suddenly felt weak. The woman investigator gestured toward the office. Please, come in. Joan took a deep breath and entered. The room felt smaller than usual. 3 investigators sat around the table. The branch manager sat quietly near the window. A notebook lay in front of each person. The woman folded her hands. Please tell us exactly what happened yesterday. Joan explained everything. Again, the soaked $5 bill, the check, the questions, the joke. No one interrupted. They simply listened and wrote notes. When she finished, one of the men asked softly, Why did you suspect him? She hesitated. I thought the check was fraudulent. Why? She swallowed. I wasn't familiar with him. The man nodded. And? She looked down. The room remained quiet. And? He asked again. She took a deep breath. I made assumptions. Nobody wrote anything for several seconds. The woman finally spoke. What kind of assumptions? Joan's voice became smaller. That he wasn't who the check said he was. Silence. The woman studied her. Based on what? Joan didn't answer immediately, because now the truth sounded terrible. Finally, she whispered, The way he looked. Nobody said anything. The silence felt endless. The man beside her wrote something in his notebook. The scratching of his pen sounded unusually loud. The woman closed her folder. "Thank you, Joan." That was all. No lecture, no anger. For some reason, that made her more uncomfortable. She left the office. Every employee looked up when she returned to her desk. Then they quickly looked away. She sat down. Nobody spoke to her. A few hours earlier, she had been part of the team. Now she felt like she was sitting on an island. Lunchtime came. Nobody asked if she wanted to eat. Nobody invited her to join them. Not because they disliked her. They were nervous. People become careful when trouble enters the room. She opened her lunch and couldn't eat a single bite. Her phone remained silent. Even the bank itself seemed quieter. Outside, however, the opposite was happening. The town had started talking. At the diner, customers discussed the story between bites of pie. At the gas station, someone claimed the bank might lose one of its biggest depositors. At the hardware store, another person said a banker had insulted a wealthy ranch owner. Every conversation sounded slightly different, but they all ended the same way. "Did you hear what happened at the bank?" By early afternoon, several customers walked into the branch looking curious. One woman approached the counter. "I heard there's some kind of investigation." "No, ma'am." "Oh." She didn't look convinced. A few minutes later, another customer asked if the bank was having financial problems. Then another. Whispers floated through the building. Joan felt every single one. Around 3 o'clock, she walked to the break room. The moment she entered, the conversation stopped. Two employees suddenly became very interested in their coffee. Another checked her phone. Nobody looked at her. The silence hurt. She quietly grabbed a bottle of water and left. Back at her desk, she stared out the window. Yesterday morning, she had been thinking about promotions. Today, she wasn't sure she would still have a job. A soft knock interrupted her thoughts. The branch manager stood beside her desk. He looked tired, very tired. In his hand was a white envelope. He didn't sit down. He didn't smile. He simply placed the envelope on the desk. "What is this?" she asked quietly. His expression softened. "You need to read it." Her hands trembled slightly as she picked it up. She opened the envelope. Inside was a single sheet of paper. Her eyes moved across the words, then stopped. A disciplinary meeting had been scheduled for the following morning. Her attendance was mandatory. She looked up slowly. The manager said nothing, because there was nothing left to say. For the first time since arriving in Montana, Joan realized she might not have a future here at all. The rain had finally stopped. A cool breeze moved across the ranch as Richard parked his old pickup beside the barn. The mountains looked peaceful again. Normally, he loved evenings like this. Quiet evenings. The kind where the only sounds came from birds settling into the trees and cattle moving lazily through the pasture. Tonight felt different. He turned off the engine, but didn't get out right away. His hands remained on the steering wheel. For the first time in years, he wished he had simply stayed home. He had only wanted to exchange a soaked $5 bill and cash a check. That was all. Instead, his name was suddenly traveling around town. His phone had not stopped ringing. A financial advisor had called. Then another. A banker. From another branch. An old business acquaintance. Even a man he hadn't spoken to in nearly 3 years. Everyone seemed to know what had happened. Everyone had an opinion. He hated it. He had spent years building a quiet life. A life far away from boardrooms, business meetings, and people who measured worth by numbers in a bank account. He stepped out of the truck and closed the door. The front porch light came on. A little face appeared in the window. Then the front door flew open. "Dad!" His daughter ran across the yard. He smiled, despite himself. She reached him and wrapped her arms around his waist. "You're late." "I know." "Did you forget the syrup?" He blinked, then laughed softly. "I forgot the syrup." She stepped back dramatically. "You forgot the syrup?" "I know. I'm a terrible father." She tried not to laugh. It didn't work. A few seconds later, both of them were smiling. "You owe me extra pancakes now." "That sounds fair." She looked up at him. "Are you okay?" The question caught him off guard. Children notice things adults try to hide. I'm fine. She narrowed her eyes. No, you're not. He smiled. That obvious? You have your sad face. My sad face? She nodded seriously. The one where you look like you're thinking too much. He chuckled. I didn't know I had one of those. You do. He took her hand. Come on. Let's get inside. They walked toward the house together. The familiar warmth of home greeted them. A framed photograph of his wife sat on the bookshelf. A blanket rested on the couch. The kitchen still smelled faintly of coffee from that morning. Ordinary things. Comforting things. His daughter climbed onto a chair. Can we still make pancakes? Absolutely. Even without syrup? We'll survive. She grinned. A few minutes later, they stood together in the kitchen. She stirred the pancake batter while he heated the pan. Some of the batter splashed onto the counter, then onto her hand. She laughed. He laughed too, for a little while. The troubles of the day seemed far away. The first pancake came out crooked. The second one burned. The third looked much better. His daughter held it up proudly. This one is perfect. I think you're right. She sat at the table and took a bite, then another. Richard sat across from her. He wasn't hungry. He mostly watched her eat. She suddenly lowered her fork. Dad? Yeah? Did something happen today? He hesitated. Children deserve honesty, but they also deserve peace. A little misunderstanding happened. She frowned. With who? Someone at the bank. The bank? He nodded. Are they mean? The question made him smile. No, I don't think so. Then why are you sad? He leaned back in his chair. Because he wasn't sad about the bank. He wasn't even angry. He was tired. Tired of being noticed. Tired of people remembering the businessman he used to be. Tired of having his private life pulled into the light again. He had worked hard to leave all of that behind. Dad? He looked at her. Sometimes grown-ups have difficult days, too. She thought about that. Then she stood and walked around the table. Without saying anything, she climbed onto his lap. He wrapped an arm around her. You miss Mom today? The question hit him gently, because she asked it so naturally, as if grief had become another member of the family, a quiet companion that occasionally sat beside them. He looked toward the photograph on the bookshelf. Yeah, he said softly. I miss her too. He kissed the top of her head. So do I. For a few moments, neither of them said anything. The kitchen became wonderfully quiet. Finally, she looked up at him. Mom always said bad days don't stay forever. A smile appeared on his face. She did say that. And she said pancakes fix almost everything. He laughed. I remember that. She smiled proudly. Maybe we need more pancakes. He laughed again. That sounds like your mother's advice. She snuggled closer. Richard looked at the photograph once more. There were days when he could almost hear his wife's voice. Tonight was one of them. She would probably tell him to let things go, to be kind, to remember that everyone makes mistakes. He sighed softly. The bank had called twice after he returned home. He hadn't answered. The paperwork for moving the money was waiting. One signature. That's all it would take. $90 million could be somewhere else by the end of the week. At first it had seemed simple. He had been embarrassed. He wanted distance. He wanted to avoid walking into that bank again. But now he wasn't so sure. His daughter looked up at him. What are you thinking about? Just grown-up stuff. She nodded wisely. That's usually boring. He smiled. Usually. She studied his face again. You're thinking too hard. I probably am. She reached out and touched his cheek. Mom said people make mistakes. He looked at her. She did. So maybe the lady at the bank made one too. Silence. He stared at his daughter. Children say extraordinary things without realizing it. She simply picked up another piece of pancake. For her, the answer seemed obvious. People make mistakes. That was all. He leaned back in his chair. The anger he thought he felt yesterday seemed much smaller tonight. The embarrassment remained. But something else had taken its place. Doubt. Was moving the money really the right thing? Would it solve anything? Or would it simply hurt more people? He didn't know. His phone buzzed on the table. He picked it up. A message from the branch manager. I felt you should know that this situation has become very serious. Joan may lose her job over what happened. Richard stared at the screen. Then read the message again. His daughter noticed his expression. What is it? He slowly put the phone down. The room suddenly felt very quiet. Because until that moment, he hadn't considered that one mistake at a bank counter might cost someone an entire career. The next morning arrived too quickly. Joan barely slept. At some point during the night, she had fallen asleep on the couch, still wearing yesterday's clothes. The white envelope from the bank lay on the coffee table. She didn't need to open it again. She already knew every word inside. Mandatory disciplinary meeting. She stood by the kitchen sink, holding a cup of coffee she hadn't touched. Her stomach was in knots. Outside her apartment window, the sky was clear. The mountains looked beautiful. Normally, she loved mornings like this. Today she barely noticed them. Her phone buzzed. Another message from her mother. Call me after work. Love you? Joan stared at the message. She wanted to call. She wanted to hear her mother's voice. Instead, she placed the phone back on the counter. She wasn't ready. Not yet. An hour later, she parked outside the bank. The building looked exactly the same. The flower pots, the white columns, the small American flag near the entrance. Everything looked normal. Nothing felt normal. As she walked inside, conversations stopped. Not dramatically, just little pauses, a few glances, a few awkward smiles. People didn't know what to say. She understood. Neither did she. The branch manager was waiting near his office. You okay? He asked softly. She gave a small laugh. No. That's honest. She tried to smile. It didn't last. He looked at her for a moment, then held out a cup of coffee. You'll probably need this. She accepted it. Thank you. They stood there quietly. Finally, he said, the meeting starts in 10 minutes. Her hands tightened around the cup. Do you know what's going to happen? He shook his head. No. Do you think I'm getting fired? He didn't answer immediately. I honestly don't know. The truth was somehow comforting. At least he wasn't pretending. A few minutes later, the woman from corporate appeared. Joan, they're ready for you. The cup suddenly felt heavy in her hands. She placed it on a desk, then followed the woman. The conference room door opened. Several people sat inside. Corporate investigators, regional managers, the branch manager. Folders and documents covered the table. A chair waited for her at one end. She sat down. No one spoke at first. The woman folded her hands. Thank you for coming. Joan nodded. Another person opened a file. This meeting concerns the events that took place at the branch 2 days ago. Her throat tightened. The woman continued. We have reviewed statements from employees, customers, and management. She looked directly at Joan. We'd like to hear from you. Silence. The room waited. Joan looked around the table. Every face looked serious. No anger, no sympathy, just people waiting for answers. She took a breath, then another. I made a mistake. Nobody interrupted. She continued. I made assumptions about someone I didn't know. A man across the table asked, Why? She looked at him. For the first time since this whole thing began, she decided to stop protecting herself, because excuses wouldn't change anything. I've spent most of my life trying to prove myself. The room remained quiet. I grew up watching my parents work harder than anyone I knew. She swallowed. They sacrificed everything so I could have opportunities they never had. Her voice shook slightly. I promised myself I would never fail. She paused. I promised myself I would never let people think I didn't belong. The woman leaned forward slightly. What does that have to do with what happened? Joan looked down at her hands. Everything. Silence. She looked up again. I came to Montana Because I wanted a better future. She smiled sadly, but I was scared. No one moved. I was scared of making mistakes. I was scared of losing this opportunity. I was scared that if I failed, everyone would think I didn't deserve to be here. The room remained completely still, so when we received warnings about fraud, I took them personally. She looked around the table. I became so focused on avoiding mistakes that I stopped seeing people clearly. The words seemed to hang in the air. A regional manager quietly asked, "And Richard?" Tears filled her eyes. She didn't wipe them away. I looked at him and decided who he was. She laughed softly, though there was no humor in it. I saw muddy boots. I saw old clothes. I saw an old truck. She took a shaky breath, and I created an entire story about him in my mind. The room remained silent. I didn't know he was wealthy. She paused. But, honestly, that shouldn't matter. No one wrote anything. No one looked away. It shouldn't matter whether someone has $90 or $90 million. Her voice broke. They still deserve respect. A long silence followed. She could hear the clock on the wall. Tick, tick, tick. Tears rolled down her cheeks. She didn't stop them. I embarrassed him. She lowered her eyes. And the worst part is, he didn't deserve it. The room remained painfully quiet. She remembered the phone call, his kindness, his patience, the sadness in his voice when he spoke about his wife. She looked up again. I judged a grieving husband. Her words came out softly. I judged a father who was trying to raise his daughter. She swallowed hard, and he still treated me with more kindness than I deserved. Nobody moved. The branch manager looked down at the table. One of the investigators slowly closed her notebook. Joan's hands trembled. I know I may lose my job. Her voice became steadier. And if that happens, I'll accept it. A few people looked up. She continued. Because I made this mistake. I said those things. No one else. Silence. But I hope one thing is remembered. She took a slow breath. One terrible decision should teach us something. She looked around the room. It certainly taught me something. The woman asked quietly, What did it teach you? Joan's eyes filled with tears again. That every person who walks through those doors is carrying a story I can't see. No one spoke. Some people carry grief. Some carry worry. Some carry loneliness. She smiled sadly. And some carry pain so quietly that you never notice it. The room seemed to stop breathing. I forgot that. Her voice became almost a whisper. And I never want to forget it. Again. Silence. A long silence. Nobody reached for a notebook. Nobody asked another question. The room simply sat with her words. Finally, the woman from corporate cleared her throat. We appreciate your honesty. Joan nodded weakly. Another manager closed his folder. We need time to discuss this matter. Her heart pounded. No one gave away anything. No one hinted at a decision. The woman looked at her kindly. You may return to your desk. Joan slowly stood. Her legs felt weak. She reached the door, then paused. No one called her back. No one stopped her. She walked out of the conference room and closed the door behind her. Inside, the discussion began immediately. Outside, she leaned against the wall and closed her eyes. She had said everything. The truth. The fear. The shame. Now, there was nothing left to do. A few moments later, the branch manager stepped out. She looked at him. He looked back at her. Neither spoke. Finally, he said softly, They haven't made a decision yet. Joan's heart skipped. They haven't? He shook his head. They're delaying it. A strange mixture of relief and fear washed over her. Nothing had been decided, which meant everything was still possible. For better or for worse. The disciplinary meeting ended, but nobody in the bank relaxed. A delayed decision wasn't the same as a good decision. It simply meant The uncertainty lasted longer. By late afternoon, the branch manager finally called Richard. This time, he answered. "Hello, Richard. Thank you for picking up. You sound tired." The manager laughed softly. "I am." A short silence followed. Then the manager said, "I thought you should know what happened today." Richard sat on his porch and listened. The sun was beginning to set behind the mountains. His daughter was drawing pictures at the kitchen table inside the house. The evening felt peaceful. The phone call didn't. The disciplinary meeting happened this morning. Richard leaned back in his chair. "And? No decision yet." He nodded slowly. "I see." The manager hesitated. Then he added, "She was honest." "Joan?" "Yes." Richard said nothing. "She admitted everything." The manager paused. "She didn't make excuses." The wind moved through the trees. "She talked about her parents." Richard listened quietly. "She talked about growing up worrying about money." Another pause. "She talked about being afraid of failing." Richard's eyes moved toward the mountains. The manager continued. "I don't think she was trying to hurt you." "No," Richard said softly. "I don't think she was either. She was scared." Silence. Scared people don't always make good decisions. The words settled gently in Richard's mind. After ending the call, he remained on the porch. The sky slowly turned orange. A bird landed on the fence near the barn. Everything around him seemed calm. His thoughts were not. He remembered Joan's voice from the phone call the night before. The shame, the regret, the tears. Now he knew more. She wasn't cruel. She wasn't arrogant. She was afraid. Afraid of making mistakes. Afraid of losing opportunities. Afraid of becoming the kind of person who struggled financially her entire life. He understood that fear more than most people realized. Years ago, before selling his company, he had been terrified too. Terrified of losing everything. Terrified of failing the people who believed in him. Terrified that one wrong decision would ruin everything he had built. Fear changes people. Sometimes it makes them cautious. Sometimes it makes them defensive. Sometimes it makes them see danger where there isn't any. He leaned forward and rested his elbows on his knees. Suddenly, Joan's actions looked different. Not better, not acceptable, just different. He thought about her parents, two hard-working people, trying to create a better future for their daughter. He thought about her leaving Chicago, starting over in a small town where she knew almost no one, trying to prove she belonged, trying to prove she deserved the opportunity. He had met people like that before. People running from old worries. People carrying fears that never completely disappear. Money doesn't always erase fear. Sometimes it simply changes its shape. The screen door opened. His daughter stepped onto the porch. She held a piece of paper. "Dad?" He looked up. "I made something." She handed him the drawing. It showed 3 people standing in front of the ranch. Him. "Oh, and her mother." He smiled. "It's beautiful. I gave Mom bigger hair." He laughed softly. "I noticed." She sat beside him. "You've been thinking again." "I have." "About the lady at the bank?" He looked at her. "How did you know?" She shrugged. "You're making your thinking face." He smiled. She leaned against his shoulder. "Is she in trouble?" "Maybe." "Because of what happened?" "Yes." She was quiet for a moment. Then she asked, "Do you think she's a bad person?" The question caught him off guard. He looked at the drawing in his hand. "No." "You don't?" "No." She nodded, as if she had expected that answer. "Then maybe she's just having a bad week." Richard laughed softly. "A bad week?" She nodded seriously. "I've had bad weeks too." "You have?" "Remember when I spilled juice on my homework?" He smiled. "I remember. I cried." "You did, but I wasn't bad." "No, you weren't." She leaned against him again. The porch became quiet. Then she looked up. "If she's not bad, why is everyone so upset?" Richard opened his mouth, then closed it again. Children ask simple questions with complicated answers. Finally, he said, because grown-ups sometimes forget that mistakes and people aren't the same thing. She thought about that. I don't understand. He smiled. It means making a mistake doesn't automatically make someone a bad person. She smiled. Oh. A few moments passed. Then she said quietly, Mom used to say everybody needs kindness. He looked at her. She did. Even people who make mistakes. The words stayed with him. After she went inside, Richard remained on the porch for a long time. The mountains were dark now. Lights glowed from neighboring ranches. The town in the distance looked peaceful. His phone rested on the arm of his chair. The paperwork to move his money was still sitting inside the house, unsigned, untouched. He suddenly realized something. He didn't want revenge. He had never wanted revenge. He wanted respect. He wanted privacy. But he didn't want someone's entire life destroyed because of one terrible decision. He stood slowly, then looked toward the house. A thought had entered his mind. Unexpected, unplanned, yet somehow it felt right. He reached for his phone. Because for the first time since this whole thing began, Richard had made a decision. The next morning the bank felt strangely quiet. Nobody knew what to expect. The disciplinary decision had been delayed. The corporate investigators were still in town. Employees spoke softly. Even customers seemed more careful than usual. Joan sat at her desk, pretending to work. The truth was, she hadn't read the same page on her computer in nearly 20 minutes. Every time the front door opened, her heart jumped. Every time the phone rang, she looked up. She felt as though her future was sitting somewhere just out of sight. The branch manager stepped out of his office. He looked surprised, then confused, then even more confused. He stared at his phone. What? One of the tellers asked. He didn't answer. He read the message again, then slowly looked toward Joan. Her stomach tightened. What happened? She asked. He looked around the room. Richard wants another meeting. The room became silent. Another meeting? One employee repeated. The manager nodded. He called this morning. Nobody spoke. One teller frowned. Why would he want another meeting? No one had an answer. Everyone assumed the situation was already over. He had been insulted. He had requested paperwork to move $90 million. Corporate had arrived. What more was there to discuss? The manager's phone rang again. He answered immediately. Yes. A long pause followed. The color slowly left his face. Are you serious? Silence. I understand. He ended the call. Every eye in the bank turned toward him. What now? An employee asked. The manager looked as though he wasn't sure he should say it. Then he finally spoke. Corporate just informed me of something. Nobody moved. He looked at Joan, then back at everyone else. Richard doesn't simply have accounts here. Silence. He indirectly owns a major portion of this bank. For several seconds, nobody reacted. The words didn't seem real. Then someone whispered, What? The manager nodded slowly. A large investment group purchased shares in this institution years ago. He swallowed. Richard is one of the primary investors. A pen fell onto the floor. Nobody picked it up. Joan stared at him. I don't understand. Neither did I. But corporate confirmed it. Another employee looked stunned. You're saying he owns part of this place? Yes. The room became completely silent. Everything suddenly looked different. The old truck, the ranch, the quiet man who wanted to exchange a soaked $5 bill, the customer she had treated like a stranger. He hadn't simply been a wealthy client. He had been one of the people helping keep the institution running. Joan slowly sat down. She felt lightheaded. One of the tellers spoke softly. He could ruin us. Nobody disagreed, because everyone knew it was true. If Richard withdrew his money and decided to use his influence, the consequences could be enormous. The branch manager's phone rang once more. He answered, Yes, sir. A pause. He's already on his way? Another pause. I understand. He ended the call. Everyone looked at him again. The manager took a slow breath. Richard is coming here. The room seemed to stop. Now, after everything? One employee shook her head. I wouldn't blame him if he wanted all of us fired. Another looked worried. What if he's here to finalize the transfer? Nobody answered. A few minutes later, the front doors opened. The entire bank looked up. Richard stepped inside. Today, he wore clean jeans and a dark jacket. He looked exactly like himself. Calm, quiet, ordinary. But now, everyone saw him differently. People stood a little straighter. Several employees looked nervous. One customer near the entrance recognized him and stepped aside. Richard nodded politely. Then he looked toward the branch manager. Good morning. The manager hurried forward. Richard, thank you for seeing me. Of course. A long silence followed. Everyone waited. Nobody knew what would happen next. Would he demand resignations? Would he close his accounts? Would he ask for Joan to be fired? The possibilities seemed endless. Instead, Richard said something no one expected. I'd like another meeting with corporate. The manager blinked. Another meeting? Yes. Regarding the transfer? No. The answer surprised everyone. Then, what is it regarding? Richard looked around the bank. Several employees quickly looked away. Then he looked back at the manager. I'd prefer to discuss it privately. The manager nodded. Of course. He led Richard toward the office. Before entering, Richard paused. His eyes briefly found Joan. She immediately looked down. A moment later, he disappeared inside. The office door closed. Outside, the entire bank seemed to hold its breath. 10 minutes passed, then 20. Nobody knew what was happening. One employee whispered, Maybe he's negotiating. Another shook her head. No, I think it's worse. The branch manager's office remained closed. Even the customers sensed the tension. A woman quietly asked if there was a problem. A teller smiled nervously and said everything was fine. It wasn't. Inside the office, voices remained low. No one could hear a single word. Finally, after nearly half an hour, the door opened. Richard stepped out. He looked exactly the same as when he entered. Calm, thoughtful. The manager walked beside him, looking completely bewildered. He escorted Richard to the entrance. Thank you for coming, the manager said. Richard nodded. Then he walked outside. The old pickup started a few moments later and disappeared down the street. The branch manager remained standing at the door. One of the employees approached him. What happened? He looked at her. Then, at everyone else. For the first time all morning, he seemed completely at a loss. I honestly don't know. What did he want? The manager slowly looked toward his office. Then, back at the staff. He requested another meeting. Another one? He nodded. Tomorrow. Why? The manager shook his head. He wouldn't tell me. Silence settled over the room. Joan looked toward the window where Richard's truck had disappeared. Her heart pounded. Why had he come back? Why ask for another meeting? Why refuse to explain? Nobody had an answer, and that uncertainty somehow felt heavier than anger, because for the first time since this whole thing began, no one understood what Richard was planning. The following morning felt longer than usual. Nobody in the bank seemed able to focus. The corporate investigators had returned to the conference room. The branch manager checked his watch every few minutes. Employees whispered whenever they thought no one was listening. And Joan could barely breathe. She sat at her desk staring at a blank computer screen. She had no idea why Richard had requested another meeting. Part of her feared the worst. Maybe he had changed his mind. Maybe he had decided to finish moving the money. Maybe he had come to make sure she never worked in banking again. She honestly wouldn't blame him. At 10 o'clock, the branch manager appeared beside her desk. Joan. She looked up. They're ready. Her heart pounded. Am I being called into another hearing? He hesitated. I think so. She stood slowly. Her hands felt cold. As she walked toward the conference room, every sound in the bank seemed distant. The ringing phones, the clicking keyboards, the quiet conversations. Everything faded into the background. The branch manager opened the door. She stepped inside, then stopped. Richard was already there. For a moment, she couldn't move. He stood near the window, looking out at the mountains. When he heard the door open, he turned around. He gave her a small nod. Nothing more. No anger. No bitterness. Just a simple greeting. She sat down quietly. A few moments later, the corporate investigators entered. The room became silent. The woman who had led the earlier meetings looked around the table. "Thank you all for coming." She opened a folder. "After reviewing this matter, we were prepared to make a final decision today." Joan's stomach tightened. The woman continued. "However, before any decision is announced, Richard requested an opportunity to speak." She looked toward him. "That request has been granted." Every eye in the room turned toward him. Richard stood slowly. For a few seconds he said nothing. Then he looked at Joan. She couldn't hold his gaze for very long. Finally, he spoke. "When I walked into this bank a few days ago, I wasn't thinking about money." His voice remained calm. "I had spent the morning repairing a fence." A few people smiled slightly. "I wanted to exchange a wet $5 bill." Even the woman from corporate seemed surprised by the simplicity of it. "I also needed to cash a check." He paused. "Instead, I left embarrassed." Silence. He didn't rush his words. He simply let them settle. "I'd be lying if I said it didn't hurt." He looked around the room. It did. The honesty in his voice filled the conference room. "I went home thinking I'd never come back." Nobody moved. "I even requested paperwork to move my money." The branch manager lowered his eyes. Richard continued. "But then something happened." He looked toward Joan. "She called me." Joan slowly lifted her head. "We talked." He paused again. "And I learned something." The room remained quiet. "I learned that mistakes don't happen in empty spaces." A few people frowned, trying to understand. "They happen inside people." He folded his hands in front of him. "People with fears. People with insecurities. People carrying worries no one else can see." Nobody interrupted. "I learned that Joan spent much of her life trying to outrun the fear of not having enough." He looked at her. "I learned she wanted to prove herself." A long silence followed. "And I recognized something in that." The woman from corporate looked curious. Richard smiled softly. "Years ago, I was afraid too. Nobody expected that. I was afraid of losing everything I had built. I was afraid of failing the people I loved. I was afraid I wouldn't be enough." The room remained completely still. "Fear changes people." He looked down for a moment. "Sometimes it makes us say things we shouldn't." He looked up again. "Sometimes it makes us judge too quickly." Joan felt tears filling her eyes. She quickly looked away. Richard's voice became softer. "When my wife became sick, I learned something important." The room seemed to grow even quieter. "I learned that every person you meet is carrying something. Some carry grief. Some carry loneliness. Some carry burdens nobody else can see." He looked around the table. "And some people make mistakes because they're scared." Silence. He turned toward the woman from corporate. "I am not here because I want revenge." Nobody moved. "I am not here to demand anyone lose their job." The branch manager slowly looked up. Richard took a breath. "Being judged hurt." The words were simple, honest, real, but making one mistake shouldn't define your entire life. Silence. Complete silence. The sentence seemed to settle over everyone in the room. Joan's hand covered her mouth. Tears slipped down her cheeks. The woman from corporate removed her glasses. One of the investigators quietly cleared his throat. Even the branch manager looked emotional. Richard continued. "If we define people only by their worst moment, then none of us stand much of a chance." No one spoke. "I believe people should be held accountable." He nodded toward Joan. "And I believe people should learn from their mistakes." He paused. But I also believe in grace. The room remained perfectly still. He looked at Joan again. I don't believe she is a bad person. She lowered her head and cried silently. I believe she made a terrible decision. Another pause. And I believe she's already been carrying the weight of that decision. Nobody wrote notes anymore. Nobody looked at their folders. They simply listened. Richard's voice softened. My daughter asked me something 2 nights ago. A few people looked surprised. She asked me if the lady at the bank was a bad person. The corners of his mouth lifted slightly, and I realized I couldn't answer yes. Silence. Because I don't believe that. He looked toward the executives. So I have a request. The woman from corporate nodded. Go ahead. He took a breath. Do not destroy someone's future because of one mistake. The room became emotional. The branch manager lowered his eyes. One of the investigators wiped at his face. Joan couldn't stop crying. Years of pressure, fear, shame, relief. Everything seemed to arrive at once. The woman from corporate closed her folder. For several moments, no one spoke. Finally, she looked around the table, then back at Richard. Thank you. She looked toward Joan. Would you please step outside for a few minutes? Joan nodded weakly. She stood. Her legs felt shaky. She looked at Richard. He gave her a small, kind smile. Nothing more. She quietly left the room. The door closed behind her. Inside, the executives began talking. Minutes passed. Then more minutes. The longest minutes of her life. Finally, the conference room door opened. The woman from corporate stepped outside. She looked at Joan, then smiled gently. We've reached a decision. Joan's heart nearly stopped. The woman continued. You will not be terminated. Joan stared at her. She couldn't speak. The woman smiled again. You'll remain with the bank, under probation and additional training. Tears immediately filled Joan's eyes. She covered her mouth. No words came. The woman stepped closer. Make this second chance count. Joan nodded through her tears. Inside the conference room, Richard quietly looked out the window. Outside, the mountains stood peacefully beneath the afternoon sun. And for the first time since walking into the bank with a soaked $5 bill, everything had changed. The following Monday felt different. The mountains were covered in fresh morning light. The air was cool. The town looked exactly the same. But for Joan, almost everything had changed. She stood outside the bank for a long moment before going inside. Her employee badge was clipped neatly to her jacket. She still had her job. That fact alone felt like a gift, a second chance, one she had never expected to receive. She took a deep breath and stepped through the doors. The branch manager looked up and smiled. Morning. Morning. You ready? She laughed softly. I think so. I think you'll be fine. She nodded. The words meant more than he probably realized. She walked to her desk and turned on her computer. Everything looked familiar. The same desk, the same chair, the same coffee mug. Yet somehow, it all felt new. A few minutes later, the first customer approached. An elderly man. She smiled. Good morning. How can I help you? He needed help with paperwork. Normally, she would have rushed through it. Today she didn't. She slowed down, explained everything carefully, asked if he had any questions. The man smiled. Thank you for taking your time. She smiled back. You're welcome. When he left, she realized something. She had been so busy proving herself before that she had forgotten the simple reason she wanted to work at a bank in the first place. To help people. Another customer came, then another. A rancher in dusty boots approached her desk. For a split second she remembered that rainy afternoon. The memory still hurt. But this time, she smiled warmly. How can I help you today? The man needed help replacing a debit card. She handled the issue patiently. As he walked away, he turned around. You're new here, right? Almost a year. He smiled. "You've got good manners." The compliment made her laugh. "Thank you." Around lunchtime, another customer arrived carrying a stack of bills and papers. He looked nervous, very nervous. She noticed immediately. A week earlier, she might have assumed something was wrong. Now she simply asked, "You okay?" The man sighed. "My wife usually handles this stuff." He looked embarrassed. "She's in the hospital." Joan's expression softened. "I'm sorry." He nodded. "Everything's happening at once." She spent nearly 30 minutes helping him. When they finished, the man's shoulders seemed lighter. He smiled. "Thank you for being patient." "Of course." He picked up his papers, then paused. "You know, kindness matters." The words stayed with her long after he left. Kindness matters. She wrote the phrase on a small sticky note and placed it beside her computer. The afternoon passed quietly. Little by little, she began noticing things she had missed before. The tired mother trying to deposit a check while keeping her child entertained. The older man who came into the bank every Friday simply because he enjoyed talking to people. The rancher who counted every dollar carefully before making a deposit. Everyone carried something. Worries, memories, responsibilities, stories. She couldn't see them all, but she knew they existed. That understanding changed everything. A few days later, one of the tellers stopped beside her desk. "You seem happier." Joan smiled. "I think I'm learning." "Learning what?" She looked around the bank. "That people are more important than transactions." The teller laughed. "That's a pretty good lesson." As the days passed, something unexpected happened. People started noticing the difference. A customer left a compliment with the branch manager. Another praised her patience. Someone even brought homemade cookies and thanked her for helping with paperwork. Each small moment felt meaningful, not because she wanted praise, because she wanted to become someone better than the person she had been that rainy afternoon. One evening, she stopped by the diner after work. The waitress smiled. "The usual?" Joan laughed. "I have a usual now? You do?" That made her smile. Maybe Montana was beginning to feel like home. As she waited for her meal, she noticed two women at a nearby table. One of them glanced in her direction, then smiled. "Aren't you the banker?" Joan's heart skipped. For a moment, she worried they were talking about the incident. "Yes?" The woman smiled warmly. "You helped my father last week." Recognition flashed across Joan's face. "The paperwork." "That's right." The woman reached across the table and squeezed her hand. "He came home talking about how kind you were." Joan blinked. "Really?" "He said you treated him like family." Emotion suddenly filled her chest. "Thank you." The woman smiled. "No, thank you." After they left, Joan sat quietly in the booth. A month ago, she had worried that the entire town would remember her only for her mistake. Maybe some people still did. But now, something new was happening. People were also seeing the person she was trying to become. The branch manager noticed it too. One afternoon, he stopped beside her desk. "You know," he said, "people are talking." She looked up nervously. He smiled. "In a good way." She laughed softly. "That's a relief." He looked around the bank. "You've changed." She followed his gaze. "I hope so." "No," he said gently. "You really have." She looked down at the sticky note beside her computer. "Kindness matters." A small smile crossed her face. Because slowly, very slowly, the town's opinion of Joan was beginning to change. Spring arrived quietly in the little Montana town. The snow on the mountains had started to melt. Wildflowers appeared along the roads. The town seemed lighter somehow. For Joan, life had slowly settled into something she hadn't expected. Peace. Not perfect peace. She still thought about that rainy afternoon sometimes. The memory hadn't disappeared. It probably never would. But it no longer felt like a wound. It felt like a lesson. One Friday afternoon, the bank doors opened, and a familiar figure stepped inside. Richard. The entire bank noticed him immediately. Then something unexpected happened. Nobody panicked. Nobody froze. Nobody whispered. Instead, several employees smiled. One of the tellers even waved. "Good afternoon, Richard." "Afternoon." He smiled politely. Then his eyes found Joan. She looked up from her desk. For a brief second, both of them simply smiled. A normal smile. A comfortable smile. He walked toward her desk. "I think I remembered the syrup this time." She laughed. "I've been wondering about that." He chuckled. "I was beginning to think I'd never live that down." She smiled. "Probably not." He placed a deposit envelope on the counter. As she processed it, neither of them seemed in a hurry. Finally, she looked up. "How have you been?" "Pretty good." "And your daughter?" A smile appeared immediately. "She's doing well." "Still making pancakes?" "Every chance she gets." Joan laughed. "She sounds wonderful." Richard smiled. "She keeps life interesting." A comfortable silence settled between them. Then he said something unexpected. "She asks about you sometimes." Joan blinked. "Me?" "I may have mentioned the lady from the bank." She laughed. "I hope only the good parts. No promises." Both of them laughed. The branch manager looked over from his office and smiled quietly. It was strange how much had changed. A few months earlier they had been strangers. Now they could stand at a counter and laugh together. Life had a way of surprising people. Before leaving, Richard hesitated. Then he said, "Would you like to stop by the ranch sometime?" She looked surprised. "The ranch? My daughter would probably enjoy meeting you." Joan blinked. The invitation caught her completely off guard. "Are you sure?" "Of course." She smiled. "I'd like that." A few days later, she drove down a long dirt road toward the ranch. The mountains looked beautiful in the afternoon sun. Cattle grazed peacefully in the distance. The house appeared exactly as she had imagined. Simple, warm, comfortable. Before she could knock, the front door flew open. A little girl ran onto the porch. "Dad, she's here!" Richard appeared behind her. He smiled. "You found the place. I almost missed the turn." "Everybody does." The little girl looked up at Joan. "You're the bank lady." Joan laughed. "I guess I am." The little girl smiled. "I've heard about you." Richard looked embarrassed. "I may talk too much." "You definitely talk too much," his daughter said. Joan laughed again. Within minutes, she felt strangely comfortable. The little girl showed her everything. The horses, the barn, her favorite tree, the porch swing. At one point, she proudly showed Joan a drawing. "It's beautiful," Joan said. "Thank you." Then the little girl asked, "Do you know how to make pancakes?" Joan smiled. "A little." "Good. Dad burns the first one every time." "I do not." "You do?" Richard laughed. "She's exaggerating." "I'm not." For the next hour, the kitchen filled with laughter. There was flour on the counter, a little on the floor, and somehow, a little on Richard's shirt. His daughter laughed so hard she almost fell off her chair. Joan couldn't remember the last time she had laughed like this. For a few precious hours, nobody thought about bank investigations, or mistakes, or $90 million. They simply enjoyed being together. Later that evening, Richard walked her to her car. The sky was turning orange. The mountains looked peaceful. "Thank you for coming," he said. "No, thank you." She looked back toward the house. "I understand now." "What?" "Why you came back here." He followed her gaze. The porch light had just come on. His daughter stood inside the window waving. He smiled. "Yeah? This place feels special." "It is." A few moments passed. Then Joan said softly, "You built a beautiful life." Richard looked at her. "Not the life I planned." She nodded. "But a beautiful one anyway." He smiled. "I think so too." Silence settled between them. Not uncomfortable, just thoughtful. Finally, Joan laughed softly. "You know something?" "What?" "If someone had told me a few months ago that I'd be making pancakes on your ranch, I would have thought they were crazy." Richard laughed. "I probably would have agreed." They stood there smiling. Then his expression became more serious. "You've changed a lot." She looked down. "I had a good teacher." He shook his head. "No." He looked toward the house. "Life taught you." The words stayed with her. As she prepared to leave, he suddenly remembered something. "Oh, I almost forgot." "What?" He reached into his jacket and handed her an envelope. She looked confused. "What's this?" "Open it." She did. Inside was a business card and a letter. She frowned. "What is it?" "The investment group that manages my banking interests is opening a community outreach program." She looked up. "And?" "They're looking for someone to help design customer education and financial literacy programs." She blinked. "Why are you giving this to me?" He smiled. "Because I think you'd be very good at it." She stared at him. "You want me to apply?" "I'd like you to consider it." For a moment, she couldn't speak. A few months ago, she thought she had destroyed her future. Now the man she had once judged was handing her a new opportunity. She looked at the letter again, then back at him. "I don't know what to say." "You don't have to say anything tonight." Tears suddenly filled her eyes. Not tears of sadness. Something different. Gratitude. Hope. She laughed softly. "My parents are never going to believe this." Richard smiled. "Then you'll have a good story to tell." She carefully held the envelope. For the first time, in a very long time, the future looked bright again. And standing beneath the Montana sky, Joan realized something extraordinary. The worst mistake of her life had unexpectedly opened a brand new door. A few weeks later, the little community bank looked more alive than it had in months. Colorful flowers lined the entrance. Tables had been placed outside. Coffee and pastries sat beneath white tents. Families gathered on the sidewalk. Ranchers stood talking near their trucks. Children ran across the grass. The bank had organized a community appreciation event and financial education day. Nobody expected such a large crowd. But in a small Montana town, people support one another. And lately, there had been something else bringing everyone together. A story. A story almost everyone knew. The story of a banker. A wet $5 bill, and a man in muddy boots. The branch manager stood near the entrance greeting customers. He looked relaxed for the first time in months. Inside the bank, employees smiled and laughed. The tension that had once filled the building was gone. Joan stood near one of the tables, helping families sign up for educational workshops. She looked different now, not because of her clothes, not because of her position. She simply carried herself differently. Calmer, warmer. She listened more. She smiled more. She no longer looked like someone trying to prove she belonged. She looked like someone who had finally found her place. The branch manager approached her. "You've been busy." She laughed. "I haven't sat down once." "That's usually a good sign." She looked around at the crowd. "I still can't believe all these people came." The manager smiled. "I can." He lowered his voice. "And I think some of them came for another reason." She frowned. "What reason?" He nodded toward the entrance. She turned. An old pickup truck had just pulled into the parking lot. She smiled immediately. Richard stepped out. His daughter jumped down from the passenger side and waved enthusiastically. Several people greeted them. A rancher tipped his hat. A woman from the diner smiled. An elderly couple walked over to say hello. Richard greeted everyone the same way, kindly, without any importance attached to his wealth. Joan watched quietly. Now she understood something she had missed that rainy afternoon. Respect isn't something money buys. Some people earn it through the way they treat others. Richard and his daughter walked toward the bank. The little girl spotted Joan and immediately ran to her. "You came." Joan laughed. "I work here." "I know. But you still came." Richard laughed softly. "She has a point." The little girl grabbed Joan's hand. "Come see my drawing." She proudly held up a piece of paper. 3 people stood in front of a ranch, and beside them was a bank. Joan smiled. "It's beautiful. I made you taller." "Thank you. I appreciate that." The little girl giggled. A few moments later, the branch manager walked over carrying a microphone. He tapped it gently. The crowd slowly became quiet. "I'd like to thank everyone for coming today." Applause followed. "We've spent decades serving this community, and today is about celebrating the people who make this town special." He smiled. "But before we continue, there is someone I'd like to invite up here." He looked toward Richard. Several people clapped. Richard looked surprised, then slightly uncomfortable. The branch manager laughed. "Please." The crowd applauded again. His daughter tugged on his sleeve. "Go," he sighed playfully. "I've been outnumbered." People laughed. He walked to the front and accepted the microphone. For a moment he simply looked at the crowd. The mountains stood behind them. The afternoon sun warmed the town. Children laughed in the distance. It was a beautiful day. Finally, he spoke. "I wasn't planning on making a speech." Several people smiled. "But I suppose life doesn't always ask for our plans." A few people laughed softly. He looked around. "When I came into this bank a few months ago, I expected an ordinary afternoon." The crowd listened carefully. "I certainly didn't expect to become part of a story everyone in town would hear about." More laughter. Then his expression softened. "But something important came out of that day." The crowd grew quiet again. He looked toward Joan, then back at everyone else. "Sometimes we think we understand people because of what we can see." He paused. "The clothes they wear? The car they drive? The way they speak?" A gentle silence settled over the crowd. "But life has taught me something different." He took a breath. "Never confuse simplicity with failure." The words seemed to settle over everyone. Some of the richest people carry themselves with the greatest humility. Nobody spoke. Several people nodded quietly. Richard continued. "And some of the strongest people are carrying burdens you'll never know about." The little girl beside Joan looked up at him proudly. He smiled at her, then looked back at the crowd. "We all make mistakes." He paused again. "I've made plenty of them." A few people laughed. "But I believe something else too." He looked around the gathering. "The worst mistakes can become the beginning of wisdom if we are willing to learn." Silence. Warm, thoughtful silence. He looked toward Joan once more. "And I think we've all learned something." A few people began clapping. Then more joined. Soon the entire crowd applauded. Joan's eyes filled with tears. Not tears of shame. Not this time. Tears of gratitude. Because she knew those words had changed her life. Richard handed the microphone back to the branch manager. The applause continued. The little girl ran forward and hugged him. Everyone laughed. The branch manager smiled. "I think that's the perfect ending to today's speech." More laughter followed. As the crowd slowly returned to talking and eating, Joan walked toward Richard. For a moment, neither of them said anything. Then she smiled. "You never stop teaching people, do you?" He laughed. "I wasn't trying to teach anyone." "You did. Anyway." He looked around at the gathering. "I think life usually does the teaching." She nodded. "I think you're right." The little girl slipped her hand into Joan's. "Can we make pancakes again soon?" Joan laughed. "I'd like that." "Good." She smiled proudly. "Because Dad still burns the first one." Richard looked offended. "I burn one pancake every time." The three of them laughed. The afternoon sun slowly dipped toward the mountains. Families continued talking. Children continued playing. The little bank that had once been filled with tension now felt full of something else. Hope, second chances, and understanding. Sometimes life changes because of huge moments, and sometimes it changes because of something as small as a wet $5 bill. If you've ever been judged unfairly, or if someone gave you a second chance when you needed it most, share your story in the comments. And don't forget to like and subscribe for more unforgettable stories here on Mr. George Stories, where life's greatest lessons are often hidden inside the moments we never expected. As the sun disappeared behind the mountains, Richard looked at his daughter, then at Joan, then at the little town he loved. And for the first time in a long while, everything felt exactly the way it should.